But we thought we'd look into the numbers on U.S. gun violence before we get deeper into that conversation. So U.S. gun violence, going to take you to the first slide here. Talk about gun-related deaths. Now, these do factor in suicides, which do make up a significant portion of gun-related deaths in the U.S. I'm going to take you back to 2013. You can see that number there, 33,636. That represented the total number of gun-related deaths in that year. If you look at 2014, not much of a change, but definitely a dip from that 636 number to 599. But then we go on to 2015 and see a significant boost, more than 3,000 over the first year almost, from 2013 to 2015, when we counted 36,252 gun-related deaths, according to numbers from the U.S. Center for Disease Control and Prevention. Going to take you one step further now, looking at gun-related deaths as they relate to the U.S. versus New York State there. That number in 2015 was about 13,487. New York State accounted for 465 of those deaths. Now, that's not just in the city, that's statewide here. In 2016, that number was 15,060, and in New York, we had a bit of a dip, accounting for 411 deaths. Now, this number for 2017 has a cute little asterisk there. According to the Gun Violence Archive, as of the time these slides were completed at about 5 o'clock yesterday, 2,230 deaths related to guns. In New York State, there were 41. Right now, as we stand here, of last reporting, that number is at 2,249. That means overnight, 19 more people killed in gun-related activities. And that number for New York State went up by 1. So now we're at 42 as it stands right now, as of the last reporting. So last slide that I'm going to share with you, mass shootings. Now, for the purposes of these numbers, mass shootings means 4 people or more shot or killed with a firearm. 80% of mass shootings perpetrators use legally obtained firearms. 2017 so far has seen 51 mass shootings. Again, that's 4 people or more injured at one time with a firearm. And this number, really interesting, especially with the conversation we're going to have today. 73%, the vast majority of folks who were killed or injured in a mass shooting, those victims are black. So that is a little look at the numbers on U.S. gun violence. We're going to get into that and a lot more in the A block.
Hillary wants to essentially abolish the Second Amendment. By the way, and if she gets to pick her judges, nothing you can do, folks. Although the Second Amendment people, maybe there is, I don't know.
That was then Republican nominee for President of the United States, Donald Trump, speaking at a campaign rally in North Carolina last summer. Over the course of the run, there were also his promises to totally protect the Second Amendment, end gun-free zones in schools and airports, and unsign President Obama's executive orders on background checks for gun buyers. Aside from the political theater, what did the candidates' thoughts on the Second Amendment and the Supreme Court reveal about what his actions as president may be?
Well, we can only speculate what may be next for our NRA-endorsed president and vice president. But next week, the Institute for Public Knowledge at NYU will be gathering those in the know to discuss gun laws in Trump's America. The panel will feature author, professor, psychiatrist, and gun violence expert, Dr. Jonathan Metzl, who's back with us today. Welcome back, Doctor.
Thank you. It's really nice to be here.
Good. We're also happy to welcome Alex Jablon. He is a reporter at The Trace. They're an independent nonprofit news organization dedicated to expanding coverage of guns in the United States. Thanks for joining us, Alex.
Thanks for having me.
And we're also happy to have via Skype Igor Volsky. He's the deputy director for the Center for American Progress Action Fund. Thanks for Skyping with us.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you all for being here. Dr. Metzl, why don't we start with you? What has Trump already done when it comes to gun laws, and what does he plan to do?
Well, that's a great starter question. I think that there's a kind of sense that the focus on guns has not really started yet. I mean, I know that there was a lot of buildup, and there was many promises made by Trump over the course of the campaign. One important one he said was that he was going to end gun-free zones on his first day in office, that he was going to do a bunch of different things. And I think he's been busy doing other things at this point. And so I think the sense in the gun violence prevention community is that we're about to see certain things coming down the pike. Now, so far, there have been some relatively minor actions. There was a executive order and a couple of other conversations. One is a beginning of a conversation to legalize silencers, which we all need very badly. A second was there's a subset of people who are on Social Security disability who were not able to get guns because they have an executor. These people are very severely disabled, and basically they're pushing to overturn that. They're still waiting for him to sign that. So severely mentally ill people will be able to get guns. And I think there are many other issues on the docket. But I think moving forward, one of the big issues that will have an implication for New York is what's called federally mandated concealed carry, allowing people from other states to bring their guns into New York. And I think that'll have a very big impact.
Can we for a second pull up, we have some of the associated assorted tweets and statements that Donald Trump has made about gun control. That's the one I'm looking at right now. A driver's license, President Trump was tweeting, works in every state, so it's common sense that a concealed carry permit should work in every state. So I'm going to go to you, Igor, joining us via Skype now. What do you think about that prospect and that equation? Is that a false equivalency saying, hey, a driver's license works across 50 states. Why shouldn't you be able to transport your gun just like you would a car?
Yeah, well, I think the issue is that if states had really robust standards for owning a gun, then maybe we can talk about having a national license. And, if we can agree on those standards, maybe that's a place to go. But what's going to happen here is that the states with almost no rules, requiring no training for owning a gun, that's going to be the floor. And so you're going to have folks coming into communities that for years have had very robust laws, and as a result of those laws have seen fewer shootings. That's going to be upended, and people who don't really know how to use a gun, haven't been properly trained on when to use a gun, are now going to be coming into neighborhoods. And I think it's a really dangerous prospect for millions of Americans who support laws in their communities to keep them safe.
Millions of Americans right here in New York, Alex. We know we're in a state that has some of the toughest gun laws anywhere in the country, but we still have 42 people dead at the hands of gun-related violence, and a lot of those guns are illegal.
What do you think are some of the most disturbing aspects of Trump's plans when it comes to gun control?
Well, I do think I agree that a federal right to carry or reciprocity law would have enormous consequences. It would create a lot of chaos and confusion. I think it's also important to note that concealed carriers are often not the people who commit a lot of gun-related crimes. It's just hard to say what the implications would be. Like so much with the Trump administration, we're moving into uncharted waters. Lots of things that were assumed to be settled are now being sort of thrown up in the air. So we really just don't know what it would mean.
So, Alex, what? No, you.
Well, let me just add to that. I just think that I'm somebody who studies this, and we all kind of work on this, but it's hard just not to get a little bit upset about the assumptions here. In other words, New York is a city that, it's every gun death is a tragedy, but the graphs you show also show a relatively, for the number of people in New York, a relatively safe environment in terms of the people's safety in their city. And I think that New York has struck a balance between Second Amendment rights. Nobody on any side of this is saying we want to, like Trump said, yank anybody's guns away.
I want to ask the two of you sitting here, what is the face of the Second Amendment in New York State? And even a little bit more granularly, New York City. Because when we think of the Second Amendment, we see all the Clive and Bundys of the world and these people and Charlton Heston in his cold, dead hands. But what is the face of the NRA in Brooklyn and New York State? Who are these people?
I mean, in New York City, it's not much of a force. It's as difficult to get a concealed carry license in New York City as it is anywhere in the country. That changes if you go upstate or out to Long Island. I was up in the Catskills with some friends hiking over the summer and saw lots of signs to repeal the SAFE Act, the New York State's law that mandated universal background checks and created a lot of restrictions on assault weapons. There are a lot of places upstate where people are not big fans of gun control laws, and they wield a lot of political power. The New York State Senate, for instance, is controlled by Republicans. They've won a lot of upstate congressional races.
Right.
Well, I agree with that. I mean, I reside in Tennessee for a good part of my life, and I'm also from a state, Missouri is where I grew up, that traditionally had a kind of strong balance between gun rights and I think the kinds of gun control that people would think of as kind of sensible regulations on limiting guns in safe spaces like schools and bars and other places. And what we've seen over the course of those states, over the histories of those states, is as guns flood into these previously safe areas, it's not just the concealed carry permit holders, who I agree are relatively well trained. It's also, you see increases in gun trafficking, gun suicide, domestic abuse, all these other factors that kind of spill out of that. And so I think the unintended, quote unquote, consequences of allowing guns and really allowing some places dense and urban as New York to have the similar gun laws to places that have happened otherwise. And I'm sure, I'd be willing to, I'm sure Igor would probably have a similar sense of this, but it seems to me incredibly dangerous and short-sighted.
Igor, do you want to comment on that? I'm also curious how you think people that are against these gun laws that Donald Trump might enact should fight against them and fight to get their voice across in ways that are perhaps different than they were under the Obama administration.
Yeah, well, in terms of people fighting these laws and changes, I think they certainly should. We're certainly going to be focusing on showing people what the consequences of a guns everywhere agenda means, what it looks like in your child's school, in a bar, in your workplace. And, I'll just note that this notion of a Second Amendment, you were talking about what the face of the Second Amendment is, this idea that what the Second Amendment really means is that anyone can own a gun anywhere, which is really the NRA line, if you boil it down to a simple tag, didn't come into practice until the 1970s, really, when the NRA really began investing in academics who would make that argument about the Second Amendment. And of course, we saw the Supreme Court result of that. And so I think this idea that Second Amendment rights mean guns everywhere for everyone is very faulty. It's a relatively new idea that the NRA really cooked up. And I think as folks across the country are resisting Trump and Trump policies, that the gun space is one where they're really going to need to focus on, because clearly it's one that, as we've discussed with all the things he wants to do, is gravely under threat.
So speaking of the NRA, we know that they gave more money to the Trump-Pence ticket than any other political entity in their history. What does about $36 million get you if you're the NRA and you're supporting the person who's occupying the Oval Office now?
Well, there's a very... Oh, please go ahead, Igor. I'll follow you.
Sorry, I'll just say that in total, if you look at all of the congressional giving, they gave about $50 million, a little over $50 million in this 2016 cycle, of course, electing members who would then see their agenda through. And in Trump's case, what it really got them is a New Yorker who in his books used to write that he supports sensible gun control, that he supports, for instance, the assault weapons ban, flip and completely embrace their guns everywhere for anyone agenda. And so, a lot of people think that Trump is this rich guy who's not influenced by special interests, where here's a clear case where he believed one thing at one time. The NRA got to him first, pumped in $50 million to Republicans nationwide in 2016, and now they're going to have their agenda seen through Congress.
I agree with that completely. If you look at Trump's writings, even from 2000, not that he has any one coherent position, but he did support things like sensible gun legislation, background checks, waiting periods for guns, limiting assault rifles. You talked about mass shootings before, and he's really had either a conversion or a come to Jesus moment, or as Igor suggested, something like that. And so there really has been a conversion, and I think that the agenda now that's being, furthered is some of what we previously thought of to be the more extreme positions in the gun community. So things like allowing guns in schools and parks, and what's called permitless carry, allowing people to just buy a gun at wherever they want without any training. These used to be seen as very extreme positions, and now people are talking about them also legalizing, as I said, silencers, machine guns, all of these things. And so I think that there really is a lot of concern. And one other point I would just make is I totally agree with Igor's point that this is not a second. In other words, even if you look at the Heller decision from the Supreme Court in 2007, it's been the conservative line for a long time that people should support gun rights because it's mandated in the Constitution, and also there needs to be some reasonable check for civil society. And so what we're seeing is pushing beyond even what the Supreme Court thought in 2007.
We only have 2 minutes left, so we want to give you all kind of a chance to give a final thought. Alex, what can you tell us about the Trace and how it informs people on these issues and more?
Oh, thanks. Yeah, so The Trace is a nonprofit, single-issue journalism website. We only report on gun issues. That ranges from how the gun business works to the experiences of victims of gun violence, both people who were fatally shot and those who were non-fatally shot, to the activities of the gun lobby and gun policy. If it has gun in it, we cover it. And we're sort of similar to a crop of other single-issue nonprofit news sites that have sprung up recently, like the Marshall Project, which covers criminal justice reform, or Inside Climate News, which covers environmental news.
And that's at thetrace.org, right?
Trace.org.
So before we do get out of here, I don't want to gloss over that number that we shared in the slides. Why is the face of mass shooting overwhelmingly black?
It's a political choice about how we defined mass shootings. In other words,
That
even
4 number?
In other words, we used to think that mass shootings were high-profile shootings where
Right.
innocent white victims were shot. And so if you look even at the old data from 5 years ago or beyond, the things that would count as mass shootings were things like, obviously, horrible tragedies, Sandy Hook, Aurora.
Columbines and some
And all of a
of
sudden
those
somebody said, wait, 4 or more strangers, that's happening all of the time. And so we've had an expansion in the definition because people were not taking people of color into account. One other point I'll just make in final is just that Igor and I will be speaking at NYU this Monday evening, 6 to 8, at the Institute for Public Knowledge. We're also going to be joined by a state senator from Missouri who's facing this kind of on-the-ground reality, a reporter from the Lancet, from the Guardian, excuse me, and a public health scholar. So we'll be talking much more, and so I'll be tweeting right after this segment about information about that if people want to hear a bit more about this issue.
Okay, we're completely out of time, but I'm going to go to you, Igor, for a short answer on what you think we can expect from a Trump presidency as it relates to gun issues. A little preview of what we're going to see Saturday.
Well, I think he's going to stand side by side with Wayne LaPierre, the head of the NRA, and really push through the kind of guns everywhere agenda. But I'll just say on a positive note that the American people are really ahead of all the politicians on this issue, ahead of Republicans or ahead of Democrats, and I think would really embrace an approach that talks about fewer guns as a solution and embraces the reality that fewer guns, as we've seen in all of the research, leads to safer communities. And I think this is an opportunity, as people are resisting across the country, to really build support for that kind of message.
Igor, thank you. We'll see you and Dr. Metzl this Saturday at NYU. And
Monday.
Oh, Monday. I'm sorry, Monday at NYU.